My name is Arjan de Haan. I work for Canada's International Development Research Centre in the programs that focus on inclusive economies and inclusive growth.
How is the field of international development changing?
I think that it is changing quite rapidly. While most of the institutions for development are not changing, the field is changing quite rapidly. Overall, the amount of aid that richer countries provide has remained the same over the last 10-20 years, $110, $120 billion every year. But there have been lots of new donors coming in. For example, China is now a major player, including in Africa. There are many charitable foundations that play an important role, certainly in particular sectors like the health sector, where the Gates Foundation is now one of the, if not the largest donor. In the programs of the bilateral donors, there has been a shift away from what is called untied aid, the idea that aid was given without promoting the donors' own economies. Increasingly, and partly because of the importance of China, many donors now are doing what other donors, including the US, often have done, is where they see giving aid also part of their foreign policy to promote international objectives, to promote their own economy, and that certainly for donors like the Netherlands, many of the Nordic donors, Canada, these have implied quite big changes. And finally, I think, and perhaps the most important change at the moment, is that the private sector is playing an increasingly important role. Not just the foundations like the Gates Foundations, but actually commercial companies that are now playing a growing role.
What is the role of the private sector in international development, and what can it be?
The most important change in the private sector at this moment provides important opportunities for international development. There's a growing interest within private companies to not only make a commercial profit, but also provide social goods, provide public goods, provide goods that are good for the environment, for example. So what you see is, if you look at what Unilever does nowadays, is that they are strong advocates not just to make a profit, as I said before, not just to sell their food products, but also increasingly make sure that the food that they sell is healthy food, that it's good for nutrition, that it has the right nutritional value, particularly in poorer communities. And they also, apart from providing better goods, they also are increasingly working with poorer communities, with poorer people, to make sure that their products also, and the way they produce the products, also provide economic opportunities for poorer peoples, either as producers of goods, by the beans that they grow, or whatever product it is, and also in the way that those products are sold. At the same time, a lot of the non-governmental organizations that have existed for a long time are also working to make their products more, and the way they operate, more economically viable, building on the example of the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh that provides loans to poor people. And these are also now products and ways of doing business that become of interest for commercial banks. So I think what you see, because of the changes in international development and because of the way many private companies are changing, that there's a convergence of objectives, and therefore new ways of collaboration are emerging.
What are some of the experiences with this new approach?
So there is somewhat longer experience. I mentioned Grameen Bank that has shown that these are approaches that can work for poor people and can be to a great extent commercially viable. Many of the newer approaches are, as we said, they are new, and the experience is fairly recent. One of the most interesting aspects of it for people, where people say that work in private companies, is that those new approaches allow them to infuse their business practices with values around more equality, around diversity, for example. In the area of development, what you see is that this new approach shifts the view of what used to be called beneficiaries. The beneficiaries of the programs now become the owners of what they produce. They get a real economic stake, so they become the producers rather than the beneficiaries. So I think it really is changing the view of poorer communities and poorer people, and that's all for the better. The agenda at the same time is new. Many of these experiences are new. One area that is in development is the measurement. How do we measure whether companies know very well whether something makes a profit, whether a product is profitable, how you measure what is a social value, what is that shared value, the extent to which it reaches poorest communities. That measurement we know is very complicated. There are initiatives to start measuring that, but it hasn't been used a lot, and that is certainly an area that will need more work. That is very important for those companies as well, because they need to show results of those new approaches. And finally, I would say there is a question whether those new approaches are relevant for all countries, all communities, particularly the poorest countries and the poorest communities, and whether the old forms of public goods, of aid, are still relevant. And I think experience will show that they are, that what we will need, what will develop, I think, or perhaps hope, is a diverse way of approaching development problems depending on the different contexts.